if you want to, yeah. If you want to interrupt me, it's sometimes a good idea, because once I get on a flow, sometimes people just going to stop. I want to ask a question. And also, if you want to put comments in the chat, please feel free to do that. And if you want to make them just to me, you can do that. If you have questions, ask any question. We're very committed to this, but we do have to also keep to time. So let's just move through now. Anna Woosi, our hero, is going to, from the Turanganuiakiwa Gisborne, and I don't know if you can see her, but Anna's here with us. So she's going to run the PowerPoint for me. So Anna, can we go to the next slide, please? So great. I don't know how many of you have seen this before. This is a key tool for Tiriti education and for many other issues. We use it a lot in all kinds of work. Yesterday I was teaching anti-racism. We use it in anti-racism work. It's a structural way of understanding that if the wave is Te Tiriti, some people are surfing. They woke up this morning going, wow, I'm going to another Te Tiriti workshop. Wonderful, brilliant. I can't wait. I see this as a very positive opportunity for environmental groups and for the whole country. This is where I want to be. Other people, maybe in different places. Not every one of us is ready to surf this kaupapa, but what this picture says is wherever you're standing is a valid place to start. In this boat underneath the wave, the bigger the wave, the more scary it is. It is also often organizations. So if you think about organizations, a number of you are connected to quite a few, they're quite committed to trying to do something on this kaupapa, but they're rowing a bit round in circles. For some people, they're on the beach with this, they're gathering kai, and they actually haven't got time to go to workshops, and they haven't got time to think about this because their life is in survival mode. That's what we've done through capitalist inequality in this country, is not to mention colonization. We've reduced some families in whānau to a point where survival is where they're at. And so this wave, it's like, I don't want to get wet. We've got enough problems. On the hill, this person has an overview, but they're not getting anywhere near the water. So they can see all the waves. They have a sort of theoretical understanding of the kaupapa, but they're actually not getting wet. They're not getting there into that water, even let alone surfing it. In the forest, can't hear it. Can't see it, but possibly can hear it. Many people have had no exposure, Pākehā people mainly, and migrants of other cultures, because we are all migrants, Pākehā and other cultures. We've had exposure to this, but not everybody has had an exposure that has really struck home, or that they've understood or had any context. So it's just something that's not in their world. That's hugely dangerous in terms of resolving issues in this country, but it's a perfectly understandable place to be because it hasn't been something that the Crown has wanted to talk about, or that many of our communities have wanted to embrace until starting now in some sectors, hopefully. In the far corner, you see this wahine looking down, and she can see water moving, but she doesn't know about waves. There are many people struggling with issues in this country, whether it's, struggling with domestic violence issues, struggling with, like in my area, I think, we've got pea addiction in my valley, we've got domestic violence, we've got people going without kai, we've got people who know nothing about this theoretical thing or real thing, but they do know what struggle is, and they know that water moves, and that's a point of connection with the wave. The helicopter, in that helicopter, you've got the Crown, you've got the media, you've got the CEOs of the corporates, you've got the leaders of big organizations, and they say, oh, well, there's lots of waves and more waves. I can see the treaty wave, but it's only one wave. What I need to say again is, for those of you who are tangata whenua here, the lived experience means that you don't really get a choice. Your understanding is like everyone else's in different places, but because of the racist colonial nature of history, it's pretty hard to escape this. One of the interesting things about this picture, and I've been using it a lot, is that some organizations will go, well, we're in the water. We may not be surfing, but we're in the water. And that's always true. I had an organization recently that a group said they were in the water, but then their Māori staff said, well, no, we're not. we're still packing the waka, we're still on the beach, we haven't actually got into the water. So it's an interesting metaphor for thinking about both your personal starting point and also your organization and your Enviro Hub starting point. Where are you actually at this point in time? And let me emphasize, there is no wrong place to be. The question is, if I wanted to learn about this treaty wave, who would I ask? So from this picture. So has anyone got any suggestions as to who I would ask?
I want to talk to everyone.
Jay, did you just say to everybody?
Yeah.
Yes, because you're right. That's absolutely the right answer. Even if you know nothing, if you're the tramper or the woman with the well and you extensively know nothing, even what you don't know, we need to learn from everybody their perspective in order to move the kaupapa forward. So Jade's absolutely right, and I'm sure probably the other person was going to say that. People have different types of knowledge, different parts of awareness, but everybody's got something to contribute to this issue, and everybody needs to be heard. I spend quite a lot of time dealing with racists who are completely against the treaty, but I do learn from that. I don't like it, but I learn from it because I'm trying to look at ways in which we can break this down. That's the responsibility of Park in this country. We can't just ignore our own people because they don't have they haven't had the education that we were privileged to have. So yep, so this picture. The other question is, how big is the wave? And I think it's pretty obvious that the wave is different sizes depending on where you're standing. But I think it's quite a good picture to use with your groups, and you can have this PowerPoint to have a discussion about where you think your particular group is at the moment. Where do you want to be, and what do you need to do about it? So it's a tool as well as a mediation project, as well as a what we call structural analysis. But it's the main point for today is, wherever you think you are personally, you don't need to say this. Just have a look and think, well, this is where I am. This is where I'm starting. And remember that that's not wrong. That is just your experience. That is just where you're starting from. Kapai? Okay, let's move on, I think, because Anna, because to the next one. So we're going to do, if we had lots of time, I would be much gentler, but you all have some experience, but I need to kind of get through this with you. So I just want people to yell out true or false, those of you who know it. The Treaty of Waitangi is generally recognised as law in New Zealand court. True or false?
True.
True.
No, false. It is not generally recognised in New Zealand court. It is referred to but not recognised. It doesn't have the power to actually change what happens in the court. So, yep, that's a one that you might want to think about more. The Māori Affairs Department was set up to give assistance to Māori people in 1953. True or false? Long time. I was born in 1953. Most of you weren't. So that was the year I was born. So you may not remember this.
Maybe
Sorry?
true. Maybe true.
Yes,
maybe
good answer. Maybe true is about it. It's sort of true and sort of false, Denise. It was set up on the one hand to give assistance, but one of the goals was to speed up the sale of Māori land. It's actually written in their goals. So that's not giving assistance. That's actually the colonisation project. So it's sort of like yes, but no. That's how this country operates. It goes yes to Māori, but no. The first education system set up by European missionaries, true or false?
False. All cultures of education.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We all get this one. I know I'm not going to spend time on things you already know. The cost of treaty settlements is undermining the economy, true or false?
Surely it's false.
Yes, because, yep, the why it's false is that we've only spent, the latest research was 3.7 billion, has been sent on treaty settlements. Nearly 2 was sent on bailing out just one company in the South Island called South Canterbury Finance. They were deemed too big to fail. They got nearly 2 billion in Crown and our money, whereas only 3.7 has been spent on the total number of treaty settlements, which are all less than 1% of what was lost. Great. Discrimination against Māori people has never been legal, true or false?
It's false. False.
Yep, totally false. There's many laws. We won't need to go into them. If you've done it with Ingrid, you'll know there's many laws that are actually discriminatory against Māori people. Most of the land taken from Māori people was confiscated by the government as a result of the land wars. True or false?
False.
False.
That's right. How was most of the land taken? Yeah. How was it taken?
Before the war for airfields.
Yeah, World War II, Public Works Act. That's the same with, that's the Whainaro Raglan story. I work closely with the Rickard whānau. I know that story well. So before the land wars in the 1860s, there was a lot of Māori land still customarily owned. But after the land wars, and also another instrument of destruction called the Native Land Court, which was set up to privatize Māori land, more land was actually taken over the next 200 years to do that. So we're going to talk about that a bit later. Abel Tasman discovered this place. True or false?
False.
Yeah. Never mind Abel. They discovered him. That's for sure. I lived in the Tairāwhiti in Turanganua, Kiwa. I forgot to say, actually, I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Catherine. I'm from Hauraki. I was born in Wellington. I teach Tiriti. I'm a Pākehā. So yes, so Abel Tasman has got, as part of what we call the doctrine of discovery that we're going to look at shortly. The Waitangi Tribunal makes final decisions about injustices under the treaty. True or false?
False. It's a tribunal. It advises the government, the Crown.
Correct.
To help
The white
negotiate.
Yes.
Negotiate. Mads. Sorry.
Yeah,
Does
go.
it help to negotiate or to recommend negotiations? Yeah.
It recommends, but it has no power to enforce. So the Waitangi Tribunal has ruled powerfully that Māori have never ceded sovereignty in this country, i.e. the Crown has no right to govern tangata whenua, but the Crown can ignore that, and in fact they do. So that's why it's not final, unfortunately. It's just a recommendation. The electoral seats were set up to ensure that Māori people would always be represented. True or false?
True. Maybe.
You'd think, but it's not. What they were set up to limit Māori power at the time because they were worried that too many Māoris would get into Parliament. So what looks like a protective measure was actually not. It was about limiting the amount of Māoris in Parliament. But it has been well used by tangata whenua and has been expanded to more than 8 seats and to actually provide an electoral option for Māori. But that's not why it was set up. Okay, Māori protest over land and other issues, justice issues, started 40 years ago. True or false?
False.
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 Why is it false?
Because it started way before.
No, absolutely. It never stopped from the moment that Hone Heke, who was keen to sign Te Tiriti and wanted to fly Te Kara, the whakaputanga flag that I will explain in a bit later, as soon as Hobson said, no, you can only find the Union Jack, that's when protest against the Crown started, and rightly so. Right, where are we up to? Next page, we're just whipping through this. If everyone is treated identically, everyone has an equal chance to succeed. True or false?
False.
Yeah, I think we've got that one now, people. I think we used to be told that equality was fair. Now we realize equality is a myth, which is about actually the dominant group demanding that everyone gets treated the same and they have different needs. So it's quite a powerful thing to unpack, and there's a whole workshop that I do, some of us do, called about equity, because equity is recognizing people's right to be different, but also a right to have good outcomes in their lives. But we cannot treat everyone the same, and the absolute failure of the education system proves that every day.
If I may, the problem
yes.
with that thinking is it treats people as individuals rather than as members of social groups.
Exactly. That's the anthropologist speaking. Well done. It is incredibly. It's the idea of individualism is actually pernicious in our culture. It's not in other cultures, but Western culture thinks individualism. Actually, individuals thrive in good groups. We are human social animals. Past injustices have nothing to do with the present because we didn't do those things and we can't change history.
False.
Yeah, no one's going to think that one was true. Except people do. This quiz was written in the 1970s and people still do. I have this argument every day that I didn't, Pākehā people don't want to feel guilty. We don't want to feel uncomfortable, it's like a rule. If you make us feel uncomfortable, we're going to get defensive. Actually, we didn't do those things. We benefited from what was done. We still do. And that's the hard thing to swallow, the benefit that comes from injustice that we receive as people with privilege. Some people advocate separate development for Māori. This is very controversial at the moment. That's the same as apartheid in South Africa. Is it though?
No, false.
Oh,
This is a big one though at the moment, because with things like the Māori Health Authority, which is a result of many recommendations to the Waitangi Tribunal, that the health system is discriminatory, and I can tell you that it is. I know that it is, the health system. It discriminates in favour of people like me. There is a necessity for a recognition that people need to lead their own systems based on their own tikanga, and that doesn't exclude anyone else, but it will be led by them. Apartheid, as the person who is from South Africa, Dan, I think it is, will know, was about a minority group forcing majority into pass-carrying servitude without any human rights. So it's almost the opposite.
This one looks like an ACT party line.
Yes, well, that's right. And we're going to have to deal with those because ACT are running their election campaign based on a racist corridor. Māori King or Queen speaks for all Māori people.
false.
Why is that false? What's the fundamental idea here? Why is the kingitanga not speaking for everyone?
Māori don't have a unitary voice. We have many, and typically organised as hapu, and if we think about Te Tiriti times.
Exactly, Hene. It's like you don't go into someone else's rohe. And this is something that Pākehā environmentalists, we must get our heads around. Tangata whenua don't float around the country making decisions in each other's rohe. Haputanga, even iwi, would not do that. Every area has specific rights and responsibilities, and it's like one of the definitions of kaitiakitanga given to me by Kuia in Hauraki was that it is a site-specific, non-transferable, whakapapa-based responsibility. So I can never be a kaitiaki, and neither can any other Pākehā, because we don't have that site-specific, whakapapa-based, non-transferable responsibility. Food for thought in terms of how we operate. The Pākehā don't have any culture, true or false?
Oh,
Yeah. The
Of
hard
course
thing
we
is
have culture, but it's in crisis.
yeah,
and false.
yeah. The hard thing is, what are the markers of our culture? So all cultures have ethnic markers, and people really struggle. Pākehā people, because we're the dominant group, we don't look at ourselves. Everyone else can see our behaviour. We have very consistent cultural behaviour, and everyone else can see it, but we can't see it. So that's one of the things that we need to unpack, is recognising that we do have a culture. It's a relational culture, because the word Pākehā, of a different breath, means a relationship with tangata whenua. Many Pākehā resist the word Pākehā because they think it means something derogatory. It is not. It's a relational term that says we are here in Aotearoa by right of treaty in relation to tangata whenua. So it's a relational culture. And what does a relational culture, what unfortunately, this relational culture hasn't realized it's in a relationship. So there's a lot of issues around our cultural behavior, but we nevertheless have it, and it's different from English culture. We're not the same as English people. I think English people sometimes get told they're coming to Aotearoa, it's an English country. It's not. It's an English colonized country, but it's no longer simply that. Pākehā behavior is quite different from English. I could run a whole workshop on it, but
I agree, Catherine, but I'd just like to know, I was very surprised when I met some elder Pākehā who suggested to me that they felt that they were English, and I was quite surprised.
Yeah, well, older people did see Mother England as their origin. We were encouraged to look at the weekend. What was that about? I mean, sorry, but the weekend was all about us being encouraged to see England as the ruler of the Commonwealth, and that we're part of that. So I'm not surprised older people see it that way. But that's why Pākehā have a lot of work to do to examine what actually is our place in this country and what is our culture. Okay, British government started to act in 1840 to prevent the French from colonising New Zealand. True or false?
True.
Yeah, partially true. It wasn't the main driver. It was one of the drivers. They were also acting to prevent Edward Gibbon Wakefield from land speculating, rather than allowing them to set up their ability to do so, because they followed up by land speculation through Tiriti, unfortunately, despite that was not what was supposed to happen. So there were a number of motives for the British. The French government were expressing interest, but the British already had a really strong relationship with Mana Whenua in the north, and so I don't think the French were the major reason deciding to act. I think we'll come to where the momentum in history goes with that. British government never recognised the sovereignty of Māori, true or false?
True.
No, actually, no. This is what's interesting. The sovereignty of Māori was first expressed in a document called He Whakaputanga, the Manifestation of Authority, 1835, 28th of October, 1835. That was sent to the British Crown and tabled in the British Parliament. And in that document, tangata whenua clearly stated that they were sovereign hapu, and no one could make laws in their country. And that was accepted. The British agreed to sponsor that document in terms of their long-term relationship with this country. So it is not true that it wasn't recognised. Now, this one's still an old favourite.
Yeah.
Moriori people were here before Māori people. How many people have heard that one lately? Still around. True or false? True or false?
False.
Why is it
Oh.
false, Mike? I want to hear from the quiet voice that said it was false first.
I'm sorry,
Do you know why it's false, my friend?
we no, sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you just know it is. it's right. Okay, that's a good start. It is. And the reason you don't know is because we don't talk about it. Moriori are the Polynesians who went to Rekohu, which is the Chatham Islands, okay? They came separately as a group. A few of them were on the mainland of Te Waipounamu, but fundamentally they did not develop as their group culture, their identity there. They were primarily, they established themselves at Rekohu. Maui Solomon, who is Moriori, has written an excellent book about this and a number of essays. But the reason why we keep hearing that Moriori were here before Māori is because it justifies us colonizing Māori. So it's a myth, one of the many myths around colonization that are useful to people. The treaty, so, read Maui Solomon, people. The treaty is an agreement between Māori and Pākehā. True or false?
False.
The Crown.
Yep, tell me why.
Because it's between Māori and the Crown.
Yeah, correct. Rangatira, it's actually between the Māori rangatira and the Crown. That's very good. It doesn't mean that it isn't about Māori and others and Pākehā. It is about that. But the agreement was actually formed, if we're going to be literal about it, between the British Crown, Victoria was 18 when the treaty was signed, Queen Victoria, and the rangatira, some of the rangatira of Aotearoa, not all. And the last question, the treaty is the foundation of New Zealand, true or false? Tricky question. I got it wrong first time.
Not sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Constitutional document.
Yes. Yeah. But when you think about who signed it, and it wasn't, the clue is what I said before, not all tangata whenua hapu, which was the structural power base of the country, signed Tiriti, because they hadn't seen any necessity for it. And like, for example, in the Tairāwhiti, Te Kania Tokarau, the chief from the coast, said, you can use my whare nui to have your discussions, but I don't need a treaty. So, I am already the rangatira here. So he didn't see any necessity for it. Tūhoi, they don't have anything to do with these hardly any Pākehās in 1840. It wasn't a big thing for them. I mean, that's because the drivers were, because where the cultures were really being exposed to each other, there was a need for action. Cool, well done, people. That's not the most exciting way to do it, but it's good to just remember that this is still what people believe. A lot of people in this country still believe those things. So that's what we're up against. The roots of colonization, which led to the necessity for something positive, which is what I believe Te Tiriti is, come from the doctrine of discovery in the age of genocide. Now, how many people have heard of the doctrine of discovery? Let's go back to the Yeah, some of you have heard of it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to the screen where everybody is just briefly. Anna, if that's possible. How many people have heard of the doctrines of discovery? A few of you, yeah. It's starting to be much more commonly part of the discourse. So there's a great book on the doctrines of discovery by holding it up by called Kia Mau by Tina Nata of Ngāti Porou, and it describes how the doctrines of discovery apply in Aotearoa. It's called Resisting Colonial Fictions because yeah, some people have to leave early. Cool. Understood. Resisting colonial fictions, and so I recommend this for really understanding this particular kaupapa. But we'll jump back so that for those of you who haven't, and it's understandable you haven't because it's not hasn't been widely talked about. We'll go back to the doctrines screen if you like, Anna, and we'll just have a look. So on the left here's this Latin statement. What happened was in the 14th centuries and beyond, which is the beginning of the Western colonial project of so-called discovery, i.e. the age of genocide, they wanted a justification. So they went to the Pope, the kings of Europe, about 6 countries more who wanted to compete with each other. Some of them went to the Pope and asked for a justification to go to other parts of the world and take their resources. This is called the doctrine of discovery. So the Pope said, and there were several of these, thanks Henny for putting up the link, the Pope said that all you have to do, because these people are non-Christian barbarians and we therefore have a right to take their countries. At this stage, they were using the non-Christian rationale, not the color, the racist color one. That one developed in the 1700s. Scientific racism really got a grip in Europe and then America in the 1700s. But in the 1400s and around the time, just after the Crusades, the Pope said, you just go, you're explorer. This includes people like Cook. Basically, all you have to do is go to the country you want to take over, read out in your language this statement, and then that's it. It's yours. Get your flag in the ground. Yeah, thank you, Mads, for putting up the stuff, because I think it's important to understand that everything has an ancestry. All ideas have an ancestry. Nothing is just invented. It all comes from, everything's based on something and has some of it very deep roots. And our colonial project in this country has very deep roots, and they start, a lot of them, in the doctrines of discovery. I think the next slide shows a little bit that's quite interesting. So here's one of the statements. We grant you by these present documents with apostolic, I always have trouble with that word, authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture and subjugate the Saracens, that was how they referred to Muslims, and pagans and other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Very healthy Christian stuff we have going on here. So this is basically, there's the Pope wearing an extraordinary hat, very bizarre. And there, that's Pope Nicholas V, and here's King Afonso V of Portugal, who went to him and asked for this so he could get his so-called great people like Christopher Columbus, etc., to go over and basically take the resources of many of the countries of the North American, Caribbean, and other parts of the world. So Cook was basically under sealed orders to annex this country and Australia as well. They didn't even know what they were called, but he was to annex them as soon as he got here. So we all hear about Cook the Navigator. What we don't hear about, and those of you who are from Anna's from Turanga, Gisborne, there's a huge lively discourse there because so many people were killed by Cook and his men when they arrived there. My area at Mercury Bay, where supposedly Cook was just there for the transits of Venus, he managed to kill somebody. They were going to burn the Endeavour, but I was reading the history of Ngāti Hei yesterday, who are the iwi that had the relationship when Cook arrived. And basically, that one guy had stolen something off the ship, and he was shot dead by Cook's men. And some of his whānau understandably wanted to burn the Endeavour, but the rangatira said, no, we better not do that because he has actually transgressed. Didn't need to be shot though. But this is how Cook operated. You know, we have a romantic view. Okay, so next slide will show you the sealed orders. So upon completing his work in Tahiti, he was told to annex any convenient trading post in the king's name. This is basically, although they were no longer under the Pope because of Henry VIII and his desire for numerous women, and they had stopped being a Catholic country and become an Anglican country, they were still basically operating under the same belief system, the right to annex whatever convenient trading post in the king's name. The fateful first 48 hours of Cook's time in Turanganuiakiwa, Gisborne, featured kidnapping and murder and is roughly representative of how he operated around the Pacific. So we need to unpack our myths and our heroes and think deeply about who really did what and what the consequences were for the First Nations of this country. Cool. Okay, we'll move on from Cook unless there's any questions about the doctrines of discovery. Feel free to ask any questions. Now we're going to do a bit of a brainstorm. So
Catherine,
yes.
Sorry, can I just jump in with one little comment I found really interesting?
Yes.
I was supporting my daughter at Massey last year to do an assignment on this stuff. And so reading and learning about that, and the papal decree that was made that you read before was still inactive, hadn't been like revoked until just a month or two ago. So the Pope actually revoked that decree just like last month.
Yeah, but did you see it? Did you see what he said?
But he, yeah. So there was some really interesting narrative around that as well.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
You know,
amazing. So thank you for reminding me, Mads, because not only that, the papal bulls have been used by in the American Supreme Court in 2005. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the first woman to get to the Supreme Court, who women have revered for her efforts, as they should, but she used papal bulls, the doctrine of discovery, against an Indigenous American Native people. So, you know, it's not dead. And that's why when the Pope went to Canada to apologize for all the murders that the church had done, all the Indigenous children who were murdered in the schools, Indigenous women went everywhere following him, holding up that banner saying, you know, revoke the doctrine. And so he's made this apology, but it's pretty weak. So it's all online. It's worth following. Thank you, Mads. That's awesome. So having heard this little bit of this stuff and knowing what you all know, what are words that you would associate with colonization, and what are the words that you'd associate with Tiriti? Because they're not the same thing and they often get mixed up. Just could people just yell out some words, and Anna's going to be our scribe. Capitalism?
Yeah, and colonization.
Yeah, beautiful. So if we can, Anna's going to see if she can write that up in colonization, capitalism. How's the right? Yes, she's just getting used to this. We're throwing her in the deep end. And we don't want to, see if it's possible. Yep, she's getting there.
Oppression?
Oppression under colonization.
Yes.
Yep. Any other words for Tiriti or colonization? Rangatiratanga for Tiriti. Yes. Yes, Hane. Rangatiratanga is the essence of Tiriti, which is about absolute authority. So when people start talking about biculturalism or they're talking about te reo, or they're talking about learning pepeha, whatever, I will say to them, the most important issue is the rangatiratanga, and that is about Māori authority. People say to me, tangata whenua mates of mine, don't try and be a Māori, be the best Pākehā you can be. And that the best Pākehā we can be is recognizing Māori authority, rather than trying to, I mean, it's great if you learn the reo, and your pronunciation has definitely got to be good in this country. It's not acceptable. It's great if you learn a lot about cultural safety, because it makes it safer for Māori if we actually have some respect for tikanga. But the most important job is to recognize their authority. That's what Te Tiriti promised. Awesome. What else?
How about consultation for colonization? So consultation versus relationship building and actual like genuine relationships instead of just doing.
Yes, because that's very good. That's very interesting, because that's the modern form of colonization, is to consult people to death. So my father used the expression consultation as a cross between a con and an insult, and I thought that was quite a good way of explaining it. versus genuine relationship building, let alone respecting Māori authority, which is actually ultimate. Another one is pervasive, pervasive nature of colonization. So true. It's extremely pervasive. And it just mutates. Extraction, yep, Holly, it's all about extraction. It's all about extracting from communities, from resources, from culture. And in fact, nowadays, one of the threats around Te Tiriti is us wanting to extract some of the things that belong to tangata whenua like a commodity. Violence, power, you're getting it. Can we have some more words on what Te Tiriti actually is? Because we want to see here the contrast. One is
relationship building, isn't it?
Yeah, relationship building, absolutely. There's a wonderful North Brisbane group, Aboriginal group, had a whakatauki about the quality of relationships is the project. The quality of your relationship depends. The quality of any of your projects depends on the quality of your relationships. And that goes for all of us as humans, but is particularly true in Aotearoa. Responsibility, that's a great word, Mads. Yep, responsibility. Te Tiriti is the responsibility that we have inherited. It also gives us a place to stand if we live up to it. In that sense, these words are quite different. Whanaungatanga. Kerry, can you tell me what you mean by that, whanaungatanga, in terms of Te Tiriti?
Sorry, I'll just unmute myself. I think for me, why I put that is because everything under Te Tiriti, I feel like everything is, if you build understanding of whakapapa and whanaungatanga, you're embodying some of the principles around Te Tiriti. That's kind of why I mentioned that.
Yeah. Interesting. I know people who are quite good at relationships, speak the reo, but don't recognize Māori authority. So I think that word belongs there, but I think it belongs there as a subsection to recognizing Māori authority. So my main thing I'm hoping that you take away from today is that Te Tiriti establishes and affirms, doesn't establish because it was already there, but affirms Māori authority in this country. So all of these other things are good, and certainly operating with that kind of relationship approach is important, but it's the rangatiratanga and also the kawanatanga, which is kawanatanga for Pākehā, as has just been said by Hene, is absolutely the opposite of a sort of woolly bicultural approach. So what I'm looking for in your thinking is rigor around power, rather than the sort of, like, we can talk about relationships, but we need those relationships to be based on rigor. And this is where words like whanaungatanga and manaakitanga are not in Te Tiriti. They're absolutely not. They doesn't mean, no, you can put it there. It doesn't mean they don't have a place in the way we try to operate those relationships. But one culture has a strong grasp of manaakitanga and whanaungatanga as a tikanga. I don't find Pākehā culture to be based on that because of our individualistic view, because these are collective tikanga, they're not individual. So I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying think deeply about power and authority. We'll come back to that later. Contrast to the pernicious mistranslations of the treaty. Well, yeah, the actual Te Tiriti is, I don't even worry about the other versions and renditions that took place. The Te Tiriti that we need to hold to, with its very clear articles, nothing to do with principles, is Te Tiriti in the reo that was signed at Waitangi on February the 6th in Te Reo Māori. You don't sign a treaty in some foreign language because that's called the doctrine of discovery. That's actually a continuation of that. I hope this is making sense to people. I'm going to check in a minute, but I'm just going to add Hene's affirms whakaputanga. So affirms he whakaputanga. He whakaputanga is called the parent, and Te Tiriti is called the child in some people's discourse. And we'll talk about that in a minute so you know what I'm talking about. And we're going to have a break at 10:30 just for those of you who could use it. But that's a good list. Well done, everyone, because you see the difference between oppressive, extractive violence versus relationships based on recognizing authority, sovereign nations. So it's quite different, but people have got it very mixed up, and it's quite difficult to get some people to understand it. Yeah, it is a blue font, so it's quite hard to read. But we're going to move on now from this one. Unless there's any questions about any of these words. Does anyone have any questions that something wasn't clear to them? It's fine if it wasn't, because that's why we're here. Because words are very powerful. Just be really careful about using Māori tikanga terminology for Pākehā ideas. Just be really careful about that. Okay, moving on.
Quick comment. I just want to note that I'm actually really worried about the way te reo words are being co-opted by corporations and government that might have the right idea, but it ends up ruining it. So like, I'm seeing corporations trying to say that they're sustainable and they're in terms of kaitiakitanga and stuff like this. And I'm a little bit worried by that.
You're not alone. I'm extremely worried. I'm also worried about the Tertiary Education Commission advising people to practice tikanga when there's absolutely they don't know what they're doing. And it's like if you put a label on the room, there's a quote later in the PowerPoint, I think from Professor Anne Milne, who is a brilliant educator, and she talks about how we're just putting Māori curtains on a white window, and I think that sort of sums it up. Awesome. Yeah. Let's move on. Awesome. Because I've got a bit to cover before morning tea. So this is a word that you may not have seen, but it's an important word. It doesn't matter that there's other words behind it. It doesn't matter at all, actually. Te waka meaninga. And te waka meaninga is the starting point for law and government in Te Ao Māori and was the mana of whānau and hapu. So it was a confederation that met in the north from 1808, way before both the whakaputanga and te tiriti. So they started meeting for a number of reasons. It was similar to the United Nations in that it wasn't a voted, like people have got really weird ideas about democracy. Westminster democracy is the only way to have democracy. This was a democratic, similar to the UN in its structure, not a top-down. It was hapu-driven. Rangatira represents hapu, and they would meet annually in different places in the north to discuss a number of things, some of which was, what the hell are we going to do with the incoming? Because they're out of control. And I think we all know those stories about kororareka, drunken people who did not respect, whalers and settlers who did not respect tikanga Māori, nor did they have any English rules. So they were a real problem. Also, there was a lot of trade going on from about early 1800s, a huge amount of Māori trade. And they were aware that they needed to, although they were a confederation of hapu and no one was the boss, and no one was voting or any of that nonsense, they were facing the world and wishing to engage with the world in terms of technologies. Food producers who were feeding all the prisons in Sydney in exchange for goods, this kind of stuff. So, and for money. So that's great, that link about what was te waka meaninga. Sometimes it's called te whaka meaninga, depends on your dialect. So it was the gathering of the people, and there are places you can go to, Taurangatira, places at Waitangi itself where these meetings were held. And I've been to Waitangi 20 times on Waitangi Day, and I have seen that this process is ongoing. There is still this gathering of confederated hapu in different leadership forms, talking about how do we deal with the Pākehā, in this case the Crown, and how do we deal with the issues of more and more people from different cultures coming to our country and us becoming swamped in our own country. So it's very interesting. Okay, so the next step. So it's a big leap from 1808, which was the first gathering of Te Waka meaninga, to October 1835. But he whakaputanga, the manifestation of authority, is something that we have not taught our people. The government doesn't want to talk about this parent document, and yet it is the basis for which Te Tiriti was developed. So it had 4 articles, 52 rangatira signed it initially, although a whole lot more, right up to 1900, have since signed. 34 were from the north. So it isn't as big as Te Tiriti in terms of numbers of people signing, but it is It was the document that established and sent messages to the world about who are we in Aotearoa. Would someone like to read Article 1 for me, please? Someone who hasn't spoken yet today, I'd love to hear your voice.
Oh yeah, I can go. No one else needs
Go.
to.
No, go, Millie.
Okay. Aotearoa declared an independent state of independent hapu, more like the UN than a parliament.
Awesome. So that's the first point about He Whakaputanga. Independent state. It's the first time the world had heard about it, actually. Great, all these links. Article 2, someone else I'd love to hear from, the other voice.
Power resides fully with those hapu.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't take it away. You can't say it resides with the actual meeting. It resides fully with the hapu. Well done. Thanks, Daniel. Article 3.
Foreigners.
All together now.
Foreigners
cannot
make laws.
Yes, foreigners cannot make laws. So this is 5 years before Te Tiriti. So it doesn't suggest that these people are about to open up their country and hand it over to the British, does it? When there's only 200,000 Māori and 2,000 Pākehā. This is what the government's trying to get us to believe. The last one. Who will give me the last one?
The English monarch will act as matua, supporting this new state.
This is a very important point because it shows you not only what's in He Whakaputanga, but also that the relationship with the British Crown was so developed at this stage. They had had so many meetings. There'd been so many rangatira had been to London and visited. Some had visited the Governor King in Sydney, and some had been and visited the British Crown. And they had chosen the British as the best country to form this relationship with. And it asks that English monarch to act as matua or parent supporting this new state, which is not the same as saying, hey, you can take over our country. This is the manifestation of tangata whenua authority. On the left-hand corner, you see that flag. That flag is called Te Kara, and you will see it all over the country. Have people seen this flag? Obviously, it's more modern style now, but it's the same flag. They chose and designed this flag to communicate to the world that they existed as a confederation of hapu as a country. One of the reasons they did it was a ship that they owned, because tangata whenua owned a number of ships, called the George Morris, was in Sydney Harbour taking food from here to sell. And because it didn't have a flag, it was confiscated as a pirate ship. And this was like, wake up, we need a flag. So this is Te Kara. This is the flag that Hone Heke tried to fly. So, yep, there's lots of interesting information about Te Kara, and you will have seen it. And so you can see this is just 5 years before Te Tiriti. Is there any questions about He Whakaputanga? It takes a while to get your head around it if you're not a real speaker, but it is a very important document in the history of this country. It's one of the many foundationals. Not everyone signed it, obviously, but it tells you that those who were gathered had a sense of their own autonomy and as hapu, but also wanted to work together. That the idea that all Māoris did was fight, which is one of the prejudices I hear quite often when I'm teaching, is absolutely ridiculous. These people decided to act in unity in order to face the world. I'm only saying it's ridiculous because I come from Ireland and England, and English had the 100 Years' War, and the Irish had a lot of fight into tribal fighting in their country, as did the Scots, as did the English, and the French, who constantly behave like they're in the tribal war right up into the 20th century. Okay. Any partai? Any questions? This is a little sidebar for you. So here's a painting. Look at this painting. It's quite interesting. So this is a painting of Hongi Hika and his colleague Hohaia. The rangatira were both from the north. Hongi with his he's standing there with holding some form of taiha. Hohaia Waikato, and they went to England and they had a relationship with the British government and the Crown, particularly the Crown. And they went with Thomas Kendall. There's Thomas, he's a missionary, to meet with Samuel Lee, Professor Samuel Lee at Cambridge University. This is 1820. And that's when basically Hongi and Hohaia dictated and negotiated the first grammar and vocabulary of Te Reo. So they brought that back as a written language, and it was quickly adopted within 20 years. More Māori than Pākehā could read and write in this country. So mainly in the reo, but not entirely. Some could read and write English with the missionaries. So they were adapting to this technology, and although an oral technology develops one part of your brain, they were very keen to use the other part as well. They wanted to do both. So it is really interesting, to see how early, because many people in England couldn't read and write. One of the things Hongi Hika experienced when he went there was he was deeply shocked by the barbarism in the English culture, the way in which people got a hand cut off for trying to feed their whānau was just utterly barbaric from his point of view. We need to be careful with words like barbaric. They're often applied to Indigenous people, but some of the practices in all cultures are pretty barbaric. Cannibalism was actually common in Europe. That's where the Grimm's fairy tales come from during times of famine. So we have to get over the idea that some cultures are civilized and some are not, and especially the idea that English culture, which prides itself on being superior in the past, hopefully in the past, don't know, saw themselves. But in fact, Hongi was deeply shocked. Also, just the whole degradation of the working class in industrial Britain was pretty shocking from their point of view. Okay, so it's a little sidebar, but it gives you context. It shows you that there was so much going on. It wasn't like one morning they woke up and decided to make a treaty. It wasn't like that at all. There was a long-term relationship. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Thanks, Anna. Oh yeah, this is the basics. So what we're going to do is I want to really get stuck into it after morning tea. But I want to just note this is the structure of Te Tiriti, and it's pretty simple. And probably you know this, but it's like if we're not constitutional lawyers, it's hard to hold in our heads. One of the things that I just want to check, do you want to unpack each article? Would that be useful? Do people think that would be useful? Can I see the main screen?
I think that would be a very good idea, Catherine.
Yeah, I'm just going to hear from others as well. Would people like to have a little unpacking of each article?
Yes, please.
Okay. I mean, I just want to make sure I'm not going over stuff you already know. But if I shoved a microphone in your face and said, name the 4 articles of Te Tiriti, how many people would feel all confident to do it? Anybody?
Not me.
No, most of us wouldn't, and for good reason. That's why I'm going to do this, because although we do workshops on it, we're not constitutional lawyers. This stuff can be like, kind of get it, but why I'm talking about rigor is it's useful to know the articles, and it's useful to try to find a way that you can remember them. I'm going to tell you a brilliant thing my tangata whenua mate invented for remembering them in a minute. A preamble is simply who is in the agreement. So it was, as someone said, rangatira and the British Crown. Purpose: to maintain the increasing influx of lawless Pākehā and to confirm trade relationships and land sales. This was starting to be a real issue with Edmund Gibbon Wakefield and many individual Pākehā trying to make individual sales with individual Māori when all land was customary and collective. They were sabotaging that while recognising the absolute authority of the rangata. Okay, so Article 1's about us who are not Māori, those of us who are not tangata whenua, ka wanatanga. Does anyone know what the word ka wanatanga it comes from? I mean, this is the language of the old days, so it's not what we brought up with. It comes from a biblical.
Sorry.
No, you go.
I just trying to remember from the last workshop that I did something about laws or like the rules.
Ka wanatanga means, in transliteration, means governor. So it is about rules, who makes the rules, but it's about the rules. What rules will the rangatira allow? They will allow the kawanatanga, the English governor, and the idea of kawanatanga comes from the Bible. These people were biblical scholars pretty rapidly, and they related to what they understood this to mean, we think, because this is all speculative, but if you read a book called Ngā Puhi Speaks, $30 online, you'll find out a lot about kawanatanga. The kawana or governor is like Pontius Pilate in the Bible, and the rangatira is Julius Caesar. So Māori are the rangatira, and the rangatira will allow a governor to reside in their country and govern over the new people. That's us, the new people. So, and obviously there was a need for some of that because the new people weren't abiding by tikanga Māori. There were constant conflicts over the assumptions of a private property-based culture versus one that had collective responsibility for and connection to their land. So Article 1 is where you and I, who are Pākehā, have a place to stand. Article 2, Māori don't need a place to stand under Te Tiriti. They already have that place. It is infinite and eternal, and it is affirmed both in Te Whakaputanga and Te Tiriti. But this is where we get to, if we honour it, we have a right to be here. If we honour this document and particularly recognise the limited nature of our authority. Can you imagine the government, the Crown sees it this way? No, they don't. So I think we need to be really, really clear. What Te Tiriti educators are saying is actually in conflict with the Crown's belief that Māori gave up their sovereignty. I have never met a tangata whenua person who said, oh, sure, yeah, we're ready to give up our sovereignty. Yeah, take it. Never met those people. There were people who feel like that it was an overwhelming force and there wasn't much choice, but I don't meet anyone who says we think the treaty said we gave up our sovereignty. And in fact, the Waitangi Tribunal has ruled a number of times that that is not the case. So I'm going to stop there because I think we need to get our heads around kawanatanga, and I think you need to have a 20-minute break. You know, it's quite full on. I hope you're actually finding it useful and okay. And I want you to just go and breathe. Hopefully you can step outside, breathe, and have a cup of tea, and then come back at 10 to 11. And then we're going to go through the other articles, and I'm going to teach you a really easy way to remember them. Because it's hard. It's hard to remember stuff unless you're a lawyer. It's not how our minds work. Kawanatanga, right? Very clearly, limited governorship. Very clearly, the Crown doesn't want it to be seen that way. They want us to think, and that's why all the treaty renditions were developed in other languages. So this was drafted by Henry Williams, the missionary. As you probably know, Captain Hobson arrived from England. Well, actually, he'd been in the Caribbean and he had a yellow fever and he died within 2 years. But Captain Hobson was the Crown rep, came to Waitangi 1840, well, actually 1839, and he had to draft the treaty himself, and he didn't know what he was doing. He came up with this draft that implied that Māori had ceded sovereignty, which is not what his instructions were. His instructions by Lord Normanby, who was the Secretary of Native Affairs in the British Parliament, was to form an agreement with, quote unquote, the natives, and not to and to organise a law over English people only. But Hobson tried to draft something that was more of an annexation treaty, and Henry Williams said to him, they won't sign it. And so Henry Williams, who was a te reo scholar, been in Aotearoa since 1823 and wrote te reo and knew all the players, drafted this in the reo. Okay, so kawanatanga. And so that's where it comes from. And it was about limited authority, but it's also about a place to stand for those of us, including all migrant communities who are not Māori. Okay? Article 2, Tanoa Rangatiratanga, and this article has 2 parts to it. First thing is it affirms the absolute authority of hapu rangatiratanga based on he whakaputanga. So it's a continuation of that parent document, and that it is about nothing is being ceded. We have to be clear about that. And the second part is about what they call hokonga, and that has been translated in a number of different ways, including as sales of land. But if you read Professor Margaret Motu of the North, who's a treaty scholar, she says that the word hokonga doesn't mean that. It means no temporary land use rights will be traded with Pākehā except via the Crown. So the assumption that private sale and permanent handing over of land in exchange for goods was permanent, was a Pākehā concept at the time, a Western concept, an English concept. For Māori, they were interested in negotiated use rights. That's how they had always negotiated their access to resources and to land, and still do. So, you know, one of the things that confused the Brits when they got here was people didn't live in one place. They had their, you know, their summer kai gathering and their winter kai gathering, and they had different, through their whakapapa, different places where they could connect for food gathering. And so when it comes to selling of land, this was not a concept. Tangata whenua understood that the British were asking for use rights to gather timber or use rights to live on land, but the British saw that as privatisation. It became private property. So there's a real conflict in the second part of Article 2. There's a real conflict because there's a lack of understanding of the tangata whenua view of land. And there's an assumption by the Crown and by everything that's happened since that private property rights are the only possible ways in which you can have use rights in land, which is simply not true, because we also have things like leases in our own legal culture. There are a number of ways in which people can have partial or temporary rights to access to resources. Let's get a bit more sophisticated about it. So that's quite an interesting discourse around Article 2.
Just to add on, Catherine, perfect what you've said, and Margaret talks about that the term lease being the closest concept to the notion of to sell, like we didn't have, and so she talks about an English equivalent, like no concept of this hoko, but maybe loosely to be a lease.
Perfect. Awesome. Oh, kia ora, thanks, Henny, because I think this discourse didn't exist until quite recently, so we're really, but it's based on old kōrero. It's based on what the people said on the day and their descendants. That's why I often reference Margaret Motu or Ngāpui Speaks, because it just references, yes, it gives us context. And I think that's what's important, because people seem sometimes unable to see things except from the point of view of how things are now. So thank you for that, ngā mihi. The third article and the fourth article are important, but they don't carry the authority. The authority issues and the power issues of Te Tiriti are most powerfully expressed in 1 and 2, but the other two are important too. So ōrikitanga, or citizenship rights. Tangata whenua have rights under Article 2 and as British citizens. So you can see when you negotiate a treaty, it's not all, the plans usually will go along, we'll see what they're saying, and then we'll adjust what we say, and there'll be a negotiation. That's what happened. Hobson had written something that Henry Williams had to totally rewrite the night before. The whole thing was fluid. But one of the things that tangata whenua are very clear about is, if you're going to have a governor, we want to have British citizenship rights there, and potentially to go to England as citizens as well. This is what we're gaining. This is our country, so we've got a right to get something out of this. So that, in a sense, if you want to summarize it crudely, means two sets of rights. For Māori, we have rights under the kawana, they have rights under rangatiratanga and ōrikitanga. So that means as British citizens as well. I don't know whether that's ever been tested in modern times, but it's an interesting kōrero. The fourth one, ritenga, or wairuatanga. So this is about, does anyone know the story of how this became the fourth article, about Bishop Pompallier? Does anyone know who he was? This is where, speak if you do, but feel free to interrupt me. Because I get sick of my voice. The French Bishop Pompallier had come in as a missionary and worked in the Hokianga. So there were many, and there still are many Catholic communities in the Hokianga based on his work. He was very threatened by Henry Williams and the Anglicans, who were based at Waimate North and Paihia, and the Anglican church missionaries. So they took their war from Europe, the tribal war between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church in Europe. They brought that war all the way to Aotearoa, all the way to Waitangi. So on February 5th and 6th, when they were debating Te Tiriti, Pompallier was very nervous. He wanted something to protect Catholicism, his main issue. So he came up with this idea. Jean-Baptiste Francois Pompallier. So, you know, there are schools called Pompallier College in the north. There's the Pompallier Centre. His name is still known. They toured with his bones he's still been revered by Catholic in the north. But anyway, this fourth article was welcomed by Tangata Whenua because they had no, and still, to my knowledge, have never had a problem with people, anyone's spirituality is free to be practiced. I don't know about you, but when I go to Tangi or Hui on the marae, if somebody does a karakia, it isn't necessarily, if somebody did one from a Mormon perspective or from a Muslim perspective, it won't matter. What's important is the wairua, the spirituality that accompanies that, recognizing that everybody has a right to their spirituality. That's a given, and it's protected in what they call the non-written article, Article 4, but there's a lot of written about it. It just wasn't put into on the piece of paper, but it was certainly a major part of the debate, and it was called the fourth article. Now, as I said earlier, and I'm going to come back to questions in a minute, my friend Kay Robin, who's from Ngaitamanuhiri, Iwi, next to, in Tairāwhiti, next to the Maunga Tukuria Paua, who the park is called Young Nick's Head, but the real name of the place is Tukuri o Paua. The dog of Paua. Paua was a navigator on the Haroto Waka, and his dog fell off this mountain cliff face by the sea. So there's a whole quarter around that. And Kay is from there. And Kay and I taught Te Tiriti together because we often had Māori and Pākehā students in social sciences in Tairāwhiti. And Kay said, look, if you can't remember these bloody articles because you're a human, that's understood. One way to remember it is if you've got the kind of mind that learns from rhyme, ka for kawanatanga, ra for rangatiratanga, rit for ritinga, no, sit for citizenship rights and rit for ritinga. And so ka ra, sit, rit. She has written a song for kohanga about it so that kids can learn it. And not everybody, some people are great at learning long things, but if you're a bit like me, when she said ka ra, sit, rit, first I didn't know what she meant. And then since then, if anyone said to me, what's Te Tiriti about? I think kawanatanga, and it all comes back. Ra, rangatiratanga. Citizenship rights, sit, and rit. Rit is like a shortening and mispronunciation, actually, but rit, ritinga Māori. Ka ra, sit, rit. So if that's of use to you, take it, hold it, and use it. It may not be, but I just thought I wanted to share it with you because Kay and I found that quite a lot of students have really appreciated having an easy way to remember what do those 4 articles of Te Tiriti actually say. Any questions? Okay. I know that you've heard this before. I know that it goes in and out of one's brain unless one is living it. Those who have worked on treaty settlements are living it. Those who are working with any kind of struggle with the Crown are living it, and they're also living the breaches of it, which is the refusal to recognise the limited authority of the Crown. So that's one of the interesting issues that comes up. Now, what I want you to do now, because I think I've been talking enough and I love you to have a chance to talk to each other, it's going to go into 4 breakout groups. And what I'd like you to do in those groups is have a talk about what do you think was driving both parties to sign Te Tiriti or Waitangi, the British Crown. What did they want out of it? Why did many 500 rangatira want to sign it, and more later? So just a bit of a discussion, and if somebody can volunteer to feed that back. We're not going to spend long in there. I'm just going to give you probably 5 minutes, which is a really short time. So I want you to just make sure every person gets to quick, 4 of you or 5 of you, quick, get to say something. And then we're going to find out, why do you think the 2 parties wanted to sign this agreement? Okay. And when to go into the groups, what will happen is you'll get an invitation. You just accept that invitation if you haven't done this before. And then you'll get a 1-minute warning and we'll bring you back together. So that's the question. It's pretty simple. What was in it for the parties? Why did they do it? 5
Sorry,
minutes.
Catherine, just remind me how long? Oh, 5 minutes. Cool.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
It's not long. It's not long. So you haven't got time to say, oh, hi, how's the garden going? I'm sorry. It's for another day. We'll just do this very quick brainstorm. Why do you think they signed the treaty? Someone gather that up and then we'll be back. Thank you. Awesome. Do you want to go to a group or stay here, Hini? Just do what you want.
Yeah, I think I'm easy. I think if it balances out the groups, if we're worried about numbers. Yeah.
You okay, man?
Oh, is this our group? No.
Yeah.
I think these two are having internet troubles because they're frozen, so I presume they're on their way to a group. I might just go jump in a group. There's 4 in each at this point, so I'll just make one 5. You guys are happy where you are?
Yeah, we're happy. We're very happy.
Cool. Okay, cool. Now I get to choose where I go.
I think that's cool because you know, when those of us who have done this in depth, it's very hard to not tell people stuff.
Oh gosh.
Sorry.
But we have to okay. Awesome that you're all back. I don't know who's in what group, so what I'm going to do is just pick someone and ask them who's reporting for their group. So, Kat, what group were you with, and have someone reporting for you? Still on.
Yep. Sorry. Yeah, Anna was lovely. Anna was going to report for us.
Go, Anna.
Yep. So we talked about from the English side of things, we talked about kind of expanding their reach and laying claim to another land, and then about it being potentially to stop another country doing the same thing, so just getting there before someone else. And then from the Māori perspective, we talked about how they were using it to allow the Crown to kind of control their people, and also to be recognized as the like Indigenous people of the land, basically.
Yeah, good summary. Those are the sort of some of the primary motivations. Well done, group. Another group. Who's a spokesperson? Put your hand up if you've been nominated to talk. Denise.
So I was in a group with Daniel, Dan, and Piers, and they will chip in if I get this a bit wrong. And so we discussed about that the British were a bit disingenuous. They wanted access to land control to stop the French, but there were some people, British people, who involved who had good intentions, but it also came from a point of British centrism. Did I get that bit right, Piers?
Yeah.
Sounds good. Ethnocentrism, the kind of cultural blind spots.
Yeah.
Not being able to understand anything other than private property, understanding different modes of relationship to land and ownership.
Exactly. Yep.
From a Māori perspective, they were looking for something sort of that was just and decent and democratic and an opportunity for partnership and trading, but also about managing the violence that some Pākehā were bringing to the country that was not working well for anybody.
Great. Yeah. No, that sounds really good. It's just colouring in. I mean, we're leaping back in time to other motivations from other eras, but I think it's important to understand them and then look at what they mean to us now. Awesome.
There was just one other quick thing. I mentioned to the group a book by the anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow, in which they make a really interesting argument that it was actually during the colonial encounter that ideas of democracy were encountered by the colonizers, and that fed into some of the Enlightenment philosophers. So people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, their ideas they were getting their ideas from the colonized, and it was actually the colonized cultures that were far more democratic than the Western cultures.
Exactly. I think that's a really important discourse we need to develop in this country as we debate co-governance, because there's such a limited understanding. And those books, what's the name of that book by David Grabner and his mate?
I love it. I'm having a complete
The History of Everything, or
it's wonderful. And there's an article where they developed beforehand. I did use in my teaching when I was still at the uni.
Yeah, I think this is the recognition of the Indigenous contribution to our world on so many levels. I mean, there is literally no hope for saving biodiversity without tangata whenua. No hope at all.
The book's called The Dawn of Everything.
That's right, The Dawn of Everything.
Humanity.
I recommend it. If you've got a little bit of time in your life, we're meant to be having a reading group to discuss it, me and my mates. The Dawn of Everything. Yeah, so there's a lot of learning, and what it does is really make us recognize that colonization isn't what we think it is in terms of the superior Western discourse. Great. Okay, who else was in the group? Who's a spokesperson? Go, Jade.
So pretty similar. We kind of talked about the Pākehā, kind of the lawlessness that was going on, the drinking and fighting, especially in Kororareka, and the nickname of the hellhole of the Pacific, and just an attempt at trying to get Pākehā to take ownership for governing their own people, chiefs wanting to safeguard and protect their own hapu, especially tamariki, from harm. And then in terms of the colonizers, same narrative, wanting land, resources, legal standing to exploit, to own, a mindset of conquest, an agenda based in the doctrine of discovery, seeking greener pastures and new opportunities away from poverty and famine and the wealth divide created by the Industrial Revolution. We kind of got cut off, so I don't know if my group agreed, but I was curious as to iwi to ponder on what we've learned today, new things that I didn't know about. Sorry, it was Hongi and I wrote their names down, but the two rangatira who went to Cambridge University.
Oh, yeah,
I didn't know that, and it really speaks to this very sophisticated, intellectual, capable, resourceful, just incredibly entrepreneurial mindset that existed. And I just think if the intention of people in partnership with Pākehā who felt that relationship existed, then I don't know, but it seems like on the Te Ao Māori side that there would have been a hope for what Aotearoa could look like in partnership with such a strong entity, such as the British Crown at the time.
No, that's awesome, Jade. I think that's beautifully expressed, and I think that's the thing, is that one of the things we say at Waitangi is, let us be the Pākehā or the tangata treaty tauiwi that Māori thought they were signing the treaty with, because it was a very genuine attempt and a very genuine basis for what they hoped would be a different type of nations of dual sovereignty within Aotearoa. And in fact, as somebody said earlier, there was a continuum of views. So Lord Normanby's view was not the same as Hobson's. The fundamental driver of colonization was driving the British discovery, but because of the mess that had taken place in Ireland, the mess that they had benefited from hugely in India, but it cost them, it was quite expensive, they were looking for a cheap way out, and they thought, maybe if we can make an agreement with the natives, blah blah, we can actually have a better, and that was one of the motivations for some. But of course, being humans, there was a whole range of views. There were fundamentalist colonizers who just wanted to take over. It hit Edward Gibbon Wakefield wanting to speculate on land without any reference to the crown or to the iwi and hapu. Well, it's mainly hapu then. So there was them at one end of it's just about land, and the other end it was, particularly amongst some of the missionaries, but not all, a more nuanced understanding about relationship possibilities if we can control our own people. But fundamentally, the belief system and the superiority of the English gentlemen, not the women. Apparently, we had tiny brains. Who knew? But this is the thing. It was of its time. And I think what Jade said so beautifully was the recognition of the sophisticated entrepreneurial, intellectual discourse that people like Hongi Hika, who was always characterized as just a warrior, which he was as well. So was King George. He was the last warrior who went into battle wearing armor. He gave a suit of armor to Hongi Hika. So there were these deep relationships and an expectation of something better. And I think that's still there. That expectation of something better still lives within Te Tiriti. It's not a colonizing document. It's been actually breached, and it's been breached by the force of colonization. Cool. Great work, everyone. Is there anyone I've missed? Don't think so. I think that's all the groups. Due to the horrors of time, 11:20, we've got to crack on because I have to finish by 12. But at least we've got the time together tomorrow to do some reflecting on what you're going to do with this. So let's move from that. So before we finish with the treaty, before I talk about this, because this actually fits very well with what Jade just said. When it comes to the 3 Ps, the principles of the treaty that the government and the Court of Appeal adopted, forget it. There's no Ps in Te Tiriti. They're not based on the 3 Ps. That was something that the Court of Appeal invented in the 1980s and 90s when they were about to sell state assets, and tangata whenua challenged them. Justice Robin Cook and the Court of Appeal basically invented these 3 principles to guide the crown. And so people working for government were often told they had to live up to these 3 Ps of participation, partnership, and protection. They're not in the Tiriti. They're not necessarily particularly evil concepts. Some of them are a bit dodgy, but the point is they weren't negotiated with hapu, so they don't have any status. Te Tiriti, if you want to put new things, you want to put new ideas in Te Tiriti, it has to be a negotiation with hapu. And that didn't happen under the Court of Appeal. It was just a legal system deciding to make up its own stuff. We've seen that before, but it's the Crown adopted it because it suited their purpose. It's confusing, right? And what I'd like to leave with you, or give to you, is the thought that confusion always benefits the powerful. So you've got to think about why things like versions of the treaty, all that stuff, all confusing. Before we move on to this example of the incredible economic activity that was happening in this country in the 1840s and 50s, has anyone got any questions that this last session has brought up for them around Te Tiriti itself? You did really well on those groups. I know it was ridiculous to have 5 minutes to talk about something this big, but unfortunately, in order to cover the ground, I have to keep pushing.
I'm just curious, Catherine. I mean, I graduated in 2015 with my social work degree, so it's old, but the 3 Ps were what we founded all of that discourse on. And I always kind of, we talked about the different versions and stuff, and I'm just curious if in your work, if you've seen that shift happen in the universities, or is it still being taught that way?
Starting to shift even with the Crown. The Crown is now talking about a key principle of the treaty is rangatiratanga, which is actually, they should use the word article, would be helpful, because I think it just makes it more confusing. But I think it's good that the Crown is now talking about giving effect to rangatiratanga. That's why there's a backlash.
Mm.
People are happy with woolly concepts like PPP and protection, partnership, participation. Participation is one of the most problematic ones. I mean, you could link it to Article 3, but, it's not helpful and it's not what was negotiated with hapu. So I don't think it's going to gain any traction. In fact, I think it's losing currency, which is a good thing because we need to go back to, for the first time, acknowledge and honour the core ideas. And that tends to be, the treaty educators, we've never taught the 3 Ps, most of us, but now I think it's becoming more ubiquitous throughout Crown thinking as well. Be interesting to see if we get a change of government, whether this whole interest in Te Tiriti and rigorous thinking goes underground again, because I've seen this before, and I'm old and I've seen it before. So I'm hoping that it won't. I'm hoping that your generations of younger people, no matter who's the government, don't let it go. So thank you. So moving on to hauraki, this is an example from my home area, which is why I use it a lot here, and I won't waste a lot of time on it, but it's just a little bit of a reality check about who was feeding whom. 1853, so 13 years after Te Tiriti. These are from the Mechanics Bay Harbour Masters records on how much food was arriving in Tamaki, Auckland, and from hauraki. An average of almost 5 canoes, they call it there, waka, per day, with produce from the listed iwi. And then there's a list in the 6 months of all the trips to Auckland, 861, the numbers of crews and the foods, the amounts of foods in 6 months that were taken to Auckland. So you see an adaptive culture that had rapidly transformed basically a kumara-based culture into a kumara potatoes, maize, peaches, wheat, ground and milled, grapes, watermelons, onions, the whole lot. You can see it's all there. And that was mainly grown in the hauraki. We don't have much flat land. It was mainly grown on where the town of Thames now sits. There was a huge series of pa and gardens. Pa were on the hill, and every hapu had their gardens beneath. And there's documentation of the beautiful food basket that the area was. There was also produce delivered in ships, so that doesn't include the ships. That's just the waka. So 12 sailing ships they owned. Hauraki is a small iwi. They owned 12 sailing ships, 11 cutters and 1 schooner. And they were getting one built. Some of them were really big, 9 to 16 tons, pretty big. And this just gives you the sense that these people had enough food, surplus to their needs, to sell to Auckland and to build an economy around of that. So it's pretty phenomenal. There's a book which is actually hard to get hold of called the Hammond Journals, which speaks of the gigantic gardens across these flats. what hurts me the most, and I'm most ashamed of, and I'm actively working in a little group that's connected to IHA called The Basket, and we do Tiriti Ed, but we also do food, was that the people now who have to go to the food bank, the people now dependent on the pātaka, are these people that had this amazing flourishing economy. So how did that happen? How did we get from that to where we are now, where Pākehā have all the land and tangata whenua children are relied on the food bank? How did that happen? And it'll be the same in your towns. It's guaranteed. In your cities, this will be the same. So you have to ask, and I have to ask, how did this flourishing food basket that was trading successfully get destroyed, or why? And it got destroyed, particularly in the Waikato Hauraki, because they stopped selling land around the 1850s and leading up to 1860s. They stopped selling land. Māori would no longer sell land because it wasn't working for them, and they'd lost a lot already, especially in Thames. But they made an agreement, especially in Waikato, not to sell land, and at that point, treaty was breached through the land wars. It was breached through the land court as well, but we'll get to that. So this is just an example, and if you went to your own area, you could find these statistics for your own area about what was being produced and what happened to it. Pretty important, and it's an indictment of where we are now. Okay, so skipping right along to the next slide. Thanks, Anna. This is the key fact before we talk about breaches. Waitangi Tribunal ruled in 2014, and then a report came out this year that reinforced that. Our essential conclusion, therefore, is that the rangatira did not cede their sovereignty in February 1940. That is a direct challenge to the Crown, who are desperately trying to ignore it. But it is a fact. It is a well-researched fact. People don't hand over their authority to other people with whom they have a relationship without a reason. There were no ships in the bay carrying cannons. One reason they might have done it was if the British said, if you don't sign, we're going to shoot you. That was not the situation in 1840 at all. So there is no reason why they would do so. And in fact, they did not do so. So we have to get our heads around that. Something that the New Zealand government, as the representative of the Crown, doesn't want to do, because it means their authority should be limited to the Kawanatanga. And I spent 9 years as an MP in the Kawanatanga, so I know that they don't accept that. They want to put Māori into a box, and they want to keep Rangatiratanga as limited authority. It's Kawanatanga that's limited authority, not Rangatiratanga. Okay, moving right along. We're going to talk about some breaches. So these have been consistent, and I just want to check and see what people know. So we'll keep moving through this. Thanks, Anna. Native schools. Some people have to leave. Thank you very much. I understand you've got other work to do. Thanks, Daniel. It's cool. Native schools, this is one in the north. The native schools were, it's interesting that most areas, like I was researching an area in my rohe called Whitianga yesterday, Ngāti Hei of the iwi. They didn't get a native school till 1900, after 1900. Like, they didn't even have any school. So one of the arguments that the civilizing project was, we bring education, but in reality they didn't. And when they did set up schools, they were basically to train Māori students to be labourers and servants. So this is the native school at Whangapai in the far north. It was also an instrument for destroying the language. So although there weren't actual, the word ban is not in the legislation, the inspector of schools went through the country recommending to teachers that they do not allow te reo to be spoken. And that's how, right into the 20th century, people were beaten for speaking te reo, including people I know who are my age, who I work with, who lost their language because, although fluent at 5 years old, because mother and grandmother kōrero Māori, all of whānau kōrero Māori, start school in Wairoa, which is a Māori community on the East Coast, and beaten by the Pākehā teacher on the first day. I mean, it's hard to imagine now that you'd beat a child on the first day of school anyway for anything, but that was the vibe. And for speaking te reo. So the mother and the grandmother stopped, for my friend Rob Wyniar, to stop speaking te reo to her at all, because they could not allow, as you wouldn't, as a mother and a grandmother, I wouldn't either, that child had to go to school. They could not be beaten every day. So this is the truth, and this is the heartbreak, and this is why we need to honour Māori authority, not just te reo, because it's not just about having a language, it's about having the power to dictate how it's used, when it's used, why it's used, and who is going to get access to it. Okay, and I mean, you know, we are being invited into this, but we need to recognize who are the leaders and what that means. Okay, next slide. This is a major instrument, as I said earlier, the Native Land Court. This is in Wanganui for you, Jag, to see this picture as well as everyone else. They were held all over the country from the 1860s on, and they were held for one real reason only. Does anyone know what was the real purpose of the Native Land Court? So people do treaty workshops but come out not knowing this, and I find it interesting because this is the major tool from 1860s through to the 21st century, which is now called the Māori Land Court, but it was called the Native Land Court. This has been an instrument of oppression and division. Yeah, thank you, Joe, who obviously knows this. Joe Herperi, thank you. The real agenda was a form of confiscation by privatization. So to get hold of the land, to release it for and divide and conquer, exactly. So a lot of land was taken during the land wars. There was a lot of what is called raupatu confiscation, direct confiscation for allegedly fighting the crown. Like thousands and thousands, like 1 million acres in Waikato. Taranaki and Waikato, huge, because I don't know if you would realize the reason why Waikato and Taranaki were such a focus. The fertility of the land, the flat, wonderful rolling pastures. It was all about the land. So that's why they were the ones that experienced well, not only, but they did experience massive raupatu. Other parts of the country, the land court was great because it was for Māori, but it was conducted entirely along English grounds. So yeah, 34.5 million acres of Te Waipounamoe. Thank you, Piers. It's mind-boggling how much land was taken. 96% of the country, and I have a graph that I don't think is in this PowerPoint that shows that we're still tracking down for Māori land. We're tracking up for Māori population, but tracking down for tangata whenua customary ownership of land. It's just massive. So the court forced people to pay for surveys of their land, would not recognize hapu. So it was always about finding individuals or small groups. And then they had to pay for surveys. And if they didn't survey their land and come to the court and assert their rights, then somebody else could. So it was a classic divide and conquer. And it led to an enormous amount of problems. And you know, the land court was this tool that continued like the 20th century wasn't a good time. Like if you start reading the history of the 20th century around the land court and around the Public Works Act, which was also a major tool. Yes, can you say, yes, please say something about the photo, Joe.
So just looking at the photo, it just brings to my mind what happened with us in Hawke's Bay with my tipuna, is that when they were sent or told to go to court, they all had to go, and a lot of them, you know, it was walk. So they would have to walk for miles to get there. And the other thing with the court is that they were never given a specific day or time. So they basically had to camp outside the courthouse until they were called in. And that could be a matter of days or weeks, is my understanding. And then the same as like what you said, Catherine, if they weren't there when the case came up, then they lost their land.
Yeah, that is so true. That is actually a fact, what you've just said. And it was the basis of the other thing that really shocked me, Joe, was that alcohol was provided. I mean, you know, imagine going to court and alcohol's provided. Like, what's the agenda here?
Yeah, so we had that at home as well. And so what I know of my tipuna is that, and other people that live in Takapau, is that they were given accounts at the shops and at the pubs. And when their accounts got so high that they couldn't pay, then the owner of the shop or the pub, they took their land. So that was another way they got land. I know they did for our whānau back home in Takapau. Yeah.
That's 100% true, because here it even had a name in Hauraki called the Raihana system, the ration system, because people were, as Joe's just said, were allowed to book up stuff. Here, this guy James Mackey, who the street's named after because he was such a who was an official of the land court, such a great dude, he got people into debt, but he said to them, oh, and he would advance money for land that hadn't even had a title established. Like, he was really proactive around giving money to Māori and then saying, oh, you're in debt, and you'll be paid through the gold royalties. But there weren't any gold royalties in this area. There were fees for miners having access to the gold lands, but there was no royalties. The Crown declared that they owned the gold, which is still their position, and Hauraki dispute that. But it was exactly what Joe said. These people were indebted, and then as a result, the whole of what they call Te Moiho, the sacred mountain here, the Te Moinaho, up the top where I lived for a long time, beautiful Maunga, incredibly tapu place. All of the people out of that area were forced out because of the native land court. So there was less in my area, and in other parts of the country. It wasn't just the raupatu because of war. It was this was a tool of war. This was the war for the privatization of this country. And that's why it's such a tragic story. And that's why if you read treaty settlements, which I urge you to do, historical accounts, you'll see again and again and again the way that the lying, the misrepresentation, but the structural things that Joe's just named are so important. The structural ways in which people were forced off their land and forced to fight each other. And I often find that think about the Tiriti settlements is not dissimilar now, that people have to fight each other, and we'll get to that in a minute. I want to hear Hine's corded on her. So let's move on. That's the native land court, a huge tool of oppression right into the 20th century, and in fact now it's still not great. The land wars, can someone tell me where they were? I've mentioned a couple of places. Where else apart from Waikato and apart from Taranaki were there wars in this country? Anyone know? You think about where there was fighting, what you've heard. You don't have to be an expert because we went through.
Here at Pukehinahina and Tauranga.
Yeah, Pukehinahina, Tauranga. The Crown was thoroughly beaten by tangata whenua, and like in the Taranaki, the trench warfare. What's so interesting about Pukehinahina, I just read this, and you'll know more than me, was they knew there was going to be a fight, so tangata whenua put out a written booklet to the British saying these are the rules of engagement. We will look after wounded prisoners. We won't be attacking women and children. Like, these things were spelled out. And the reason they had to spell it out was because the British didn't stick by those rules. And you'll see in all the wars across that, and that, because often Pukehinahina is told as a story, and it's not my story, it belongs to Hine and the people of the Bay, but it was told as if this was this incredible acts of individual courage and Māori people giving water to wounded British soldiers. In fact, it was the manual that they had actually put out saying this is how we need to have, so we're going to fight, let's fight in a decent way. These are all the myths that don't get talked about. Anywhere else, people, where else was there fighting?
Wanganui, Waikato.
Yep. The Taranaki Wars spread into Wanganui. The Waikato Wars spread into Hauraki. My area, there's a place called Miranda Hot Springs. The Miranda was an HMS. Miranda was a gunboat that destroyed the village of Pukorokoro, the actual name of where the wetland, where the birds are, Pukorokoro. So these are names that carry a lot of negative power, and they need to be got rid of. It's not Miranda, it's Pukorokoro, and you'll have these stories in your area. But I just want to think, I don't think we realized there was the Tairāwhiti Te Koti Rikarangi, who was actually fighting with the British for a while. He was a missionary child, raised child. He was accused of being on the side of his own people and sent to Rekohu, the Chatham Islands, with 100 of his people. And that's where the Ringatu spiritual faith was developed. but he captured a ship and came back and fought his way back to try and take his land back, which was stolen while he was away. And then he was driven up through the colonial forces, fought him up through the Tuhoi country, where many villages were burned for supporting Te Kooti. So he's been demonized, like many people, and he was never allowed back into. He actually had refuge in the Maniapoto country, but never got back. And Waikato never got back to Tairāwhiti and was demonized. His descendants were demonized. So these wars left long shadows. Does anyone know who in the picture it is on the right-hand side, the guy holding up the sword, who that is?
It's not Von Temsky.
Yes, Von Temsky. Who's Von Temsky?
Oh, he was a horrible man.
Good summary.
I just remember that E Pātoho, the Motiatia, was based around what happened to the people there.
Yeah, he was a piece of work, that guy. Von Temsky. Is that what you wanted to have spelled out, Piers? Von Temsky? Because he ran this group of like the SAS, like a sort of a unit attached to the British, but not under complete control of the British, called the Forest Rangers. And so they went around, and he kept diaries, incredibly racist, like, you know, every day he killed someone. It was a good day for him. So he has just had a street in Kirikiri or Hamilton. They just changed the name. Some of you who are from Goiko will have heard of this too. We are trying to get rid of the celebration of violence in this country by people who attack tangata whenua. Yeah, Gustavus von Temsky. Yeah, that's the dude. So yeah, there was a lot of fighting. There was also an issue at Wairau in the top of in the Tau Ihu, the top of the South Island, which between Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Haitia, and some had a struggle with some of the settlers who again were assuming rights they didn't have, and then shot Te Rangi Haitia's wife. So that started a bit of a scrap. There were fights around Te Upuko o Te Eka, which is Wellington, Te Awakairangi, Lower Hutt. You know, we basically, there were the Northern Wars that happened not long after the signing of Te Tiriti. And if you want to read the really cool and listen to and watch, there's some really cool reinterpretation of these stories by Mihi Narangi Forbes on Radio New Zealand. So they're podcasts and stories. Yes, go Joe.
Oh, I just want to quickly mention about Von Temsky, something when I was doing a class a few years ago. So a lot of the stuff that's written about him that is accessible to New Zealand, it really glorifies him.
Ooh.
But to find out the real story of what he did, it's in Motiatia, but you also need to talk to the people, you know, to the tangata whenua, the hapu, because it's locked up and it's in their whakapapa and it's in these stories. But what you'll read, and I'm not sure about that link there, it will show him to be a really good person and stuff. He was a murderer.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And this is the thing, it's like we are asking people in the education system now, they want to tell the other side of the story. But again, it's like Joe just said, these are in the motetea, they are in the whakapapa of the hapu, and it is very, very painful and also very important knowledge that belongs to them. And so rather than saying, oh, we're just going to rewrite history and make it look a bit better, we need to hear how they would like it to be approached. How you, Joe, and your whānau, like all of the things that people have been through, how would you like this to be taught? And not to just exploit the goodwill of tangata whenua to share their stories into situations where they become isolated facts rather than part of people's DNA, you know, people's historical hurt. So it's not simple. The land wars left a lot of damage. I mean, there are atrocities, which Von Temsky was part of, but also one of the most famous is at a place called Rangi o Wāwhia in the Waikato, where some people were burnt to death in the church because if they came out, the British soldiers were going to shoot them. They were elders and women and children. And, you know, those kind of hurts don't go away, but because the denial has created another layer of hurt. It's like a wound, and then you just try and cover it over. It cannot heal. So we've got work to do on this kaupapa. It's very sobering. So thank you very much, Joe, for your contribution, Henny, because this has lived in our DNA, and we know now, some have always known this, that trauma is passed on in a genetic sense. It's traumatic. That's right, Jasmine. It is traumatic, and that trauma gets passed on. So that hurt, that damage, people live with that today, and that's why we actually always have to, as Pākehās, we have to, and non-Pākehā, but non-Māori, have to stop and think, where am I? What happened on this ground? And what could that mean? Who do I need to listen to understand where I'm living? Rather than just blithely kind of like, environmental groups are great for the work we do, but we really also need to reflect on this in order to be safe within the rohe of the tangata whenua and with all that has happened. The land wars. Okay, let's move on, because as I said, the Native Land Court did just as much damage. And then you've got the law, another fabulous thing. The Tohunga Suppression Act is just one example of many laws, which was the taking of making the customary knowledge illegal in 1907. There's a whole discourse around why it happened, but the reality is that the fact that it did happen, and there were several Tohunga Suppression Acts, its impact was to destroy the traditional ways of knowing and being. And so the rationales for these laws are interesting, but they are not justified in terms of what has happened. So that went on into the 20th century, into the 20th century, and it's still a struggle for Māori trying to get the law to recognise rongoa and recognise the wisdom of the tohunga. It's huge. But I know we haven't got a lot of time, so what I'd like to do now is talk about one particular thing relevant to environmental groups. And this is an experience I had when I went to this island called Hauturu. Does anyone know which island I'm referring to? Hauturu. It's in the Hauraki Gulf, or Tikapa Moana, which is the correct name for one iwi of the Hauraki Gulf. Hauturu is a little barrier, and it's what they call so Ngāti Wai generally spoke, Ngāti Wai and Hauraki Island with various disagreements, but primarily Ngāti Wai were living there in early 1900s, when in their wisdom the Crown decided to make a park there. And I'm telling you this because I want you to think about parks and reserves. Both words have toxicity associated with them and historical problems. So we have to unpack that as environmentalists. So the parks and reserves, this concept was applied to Hauturu. And I went over there, and it's amazing because, there's no people, lots of birds, whatever, quite a few years ago. And I was wandering around, and being me, I found a little booklet in a house that was there, this little building that was there, because people come and go and dock workers stay there. And the little booklet told the story of the creation of the Hauturu as a reserve, as a bird sanctuary. And it describes how the chief of Ngāti Wai, the elder, he was an old man, refused to leave. And they said, oh no, you can't stay here because this is going to be a reserve for birds. You can't stay here. You're not a bird. And they dragged him off that island in chains and took him to the mainland, where he died a week later, that Ngāti Wai rangatira. His daughter swam back from the mainland a number of times, and each time they threw her off eventually. So that's our park. That's our wonderful bird sanctuary. And so we have to ask the question, at what price were these reserves created? Who has lost and who has benefited? And it's based on the assumption that Pākehā conservation is obsessed with, which is setting up places where people can't go. And in the end, that's culturally bizarre, because for tangata whenua culture, the relationships can be healed by living with, not by cutting themselves off from the relationship they have with the manu and all the other species. It's very interesting because a lot of conservation is based on these concepts. You do see things like Mangatotiri and the Waikato where you've got a joint, the maunga is being protected from pests and is a joint management by tangata whenua and some of the farming community, and it's had its interesting moments. Because conceptually, environmental movement and the conservation movement has failed to come to grips with the differences. So we're just going to quickly have a look at those before we finish. Moving on, but I want you to think about parks. So as I said earlier, conservation is not the same as kaitiakitanga, kaitiakitanga, whakapapa-based, site-specific, non-transferable. That's just one person who was our leader on these issues in Hauraki from Ngāti Maru, Ngāti Pūkenga. That's just what Auntie Betty taught me. But the point is that we as conservationists or environmentalists cannot co-opt concepts we don't understand. We cannot claim that the concepts of parks and reserves have been part of recognizing Te Tiriti, because they haven't. In the settlements, you'll see quite a lot of someone's putting up something interesting, so I have to read it. They want to make a bike path from Pukeiti to the coast. This was voted down by iwi for valid reasons. I mean, this is the stories of this country. It's all about taking advantage, and it's all about not listening to what's really going on. And if you want to see who the well-being issues, you really need to think about these. I think there's one more slide about settlements we need to cover. I want you to think about this. We're not going to have time for that. This is where Te Tiriti has taken us. So it's a good place to stop for today, because tomorrow we're going to look at Mātiki and the rest. I always say, yes, there's a lot of co-option going on here. I always say that Te Tiriti settlements are a bit like a bent hubcap. We stole your car, and then the thief is telling you you can come back and apply. Sounds like the land courts kind of, doesn't it? Apply to get your hubcap back, but you've got, and it's bent, sorry, but you've got to prove that your hubcap is yours and not your neighbour's. And so although this is the only access to resources that tangata whenua have, and there have been some positive gains made from it, it is really based on a Crown dictated process. I just want to go to you, Henny, to see if you have a couple of thoughts.
I like the analogy.
Yes.
It's totally, total Glenn. It's so nuanced in many cases, and even I think there's an exercise whereby we to look at a historical account, and to bear in mind if when we do this, it has information, but even the process, like that's the monetary reflection, like it's less than 1%, but also even things like history, and I guess it's really pertinent in context of like it being taught in schools and so forth. But my experiences and learning from others who have gone through this as a teina, as a like younger sibling to some others, that thinking of that relationship, the historical account, we had to fight and fight and fight. So particularly if I base up what you've already talked about, so for the Ngāti Pawa iwi settlement, the Miranda story. So Miranda was the warship that killed my local hapu, and to get that even written was denied for the Crown simply because there was no written record. It was all in, like we talked about, Joe was talking about more tere, so Māori oral repositories of knowledge. It was within that, but there was no like Western written down, and so it was denied for so long until we actually did find a particular note that confirmed it. So to think about that in context of the treaty settlements, is by which it's iwi and Māori are constantly marginalised through the process, and I think they're really revered in media, and it's not until you listen to the people who actually have to work in those claims for years, for generations, that it reveals like the layers of actually these settlements are actually really traumatic, and they're often like the purpose. There are many benefits for the Crown as well in terms of assimilating Māori to, if we think they do go through the process, we have to assimilate to these Western ways of being, like a post-governance entity, which is very much like a capitalistic model, which actually wasn't based on tikanga. So there's just so much layers, and they are very like divide and rule. As you said, you have to fight your neighbour and you have to conform to these ways of being which aren't relational. So, and then I guess from an organisation, if you're a Pākehā organisation trying to engage, engage in inverted commas, and people are like, oh, well, we don't know who the mana whenua are, and there's so many, and there's so much layers. This is like deliberate. And I think that it's really important for organisations to really understand that this is on purpose. The Crown has purposely tried to divide and rule iwi, and for people to try and build relationships, it's actually beyond a post-governance settlement, and that's not necessarily reflective of the people. It might be 5 corporate people who make the decisions on behalf of thousands who may be disconnected. So yeah, there's just so many layers. I could talk about this for ages, but just to give a little bit of kōrero to that topic. You're on mute, Catherine.
Yeah. Oops. Thank you for that, tēnā koe, because it's true and it's painful and it's multi-layered, like you said, and that's why I kind of use the car analogy sometimes to try and simplify it for people who have not lived through this. But people have lived and died fighting for the scraps they get. One of the things that shocked me when I was on the Māori Affairs Select Committee, which you all need to know, I'm sure that Joe and Hini and others know it already, is that the land that's been returned is, if it's got any commercial value, then the tangata whenua have to buy it back. So it's not like, oh, we're going to give you all this land back. Very little land is given back. There's a lot that's in some form of co-governance structure with councils and DOC, but there are a few sort of small sites in each settlement that go back. Buy it back at market rates is exactly the issue. And it's like when the thief tells you you have to buy back the thing at market rates, it's not justice. And that's what we're holding up to the world, is what great progress we're making. I think the really great statement. And then one of the things that's worse about it is it says in all the settlements full and final, i.e. you're not supposed to be able to ask for anything else. That's it. Moana Jackson, personal hero of mine, who passed away on 31st of March last year, said treaties are honoured, not settled. So it's about the honouring. We've really come to a moment, it's 1 minute to 12, and I just want to acknowledge that this has been really intense, and I want to acknowledge those for whom it is an active and painful part of their life. Those of you who have heard things that you already know because you've lived them, and for those of you for whom it's new, we need to remember there's a lot of pain. I just want to acknowledge the mamae, the hurt. I also want to acknowledge the incredible willingness in this group to listen, which has been really appreciated. I want you for homework to go away and actually, if you've got things going on for homework, like if you've got a meeting, if you've got children, if you've got a headache, if you've got something to watch on Netflix, just do that, because I don't really want to give you things to do, because I just know people's lives are pretty full. But if you want to have a think about it, just Google, you could Google Mātiki Mai, or what I would like you to think about, probably even more than that, is if your centre or your work where you are, the rōpūs that you're mainly part of, which brings you to here today, if you want to make a little quick list of what do you think the core values are. And I don't mean the list you've got in your deed or your title document or whatever. What do you think the actual core values are for you and working in this, and for this centre that you work in? Because we want to talk about some core value work tomorrow morning when we're talking about constitutional transformation. And then which is like, transformation of our constitution isn't just about governments and national, it's about what we do in our own communities, which is what we're going to focus on tomorrow. Very good. What I'd like to do now, though, is just acknowledge the contribution of everybody and your patience and courtesy. And I want to ask Joe, since you opened, whether you'd like to close with that ehua or whatever suits you.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, kia ora.
Kia ora. So thanks, Catherine. And this has been really, really enlightening and interesting. And yeah, I've loved it. Can't wait for tomorrow.
Thank you.
Mi noi tātou, kia tātou katoa, te ata whao tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake. Amini.
Amini, kia ora. Tēnā koe, Joe. Thank you for keeping us safe through the process. Thank you, everybody. Go and have lunch.